Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Ivan Flis from Hernica University in Croatia. And Ivan is a psychologist come historian who started out in psychology and gradually found himself doing history of psychology. And in Interacting Minds, we like to contextualize things. We sort of like to start at the beginning whenever we have a problem, even if it looks like the problem's solved. And the best way to start at the beginning is to bring in a historian. So, thank you very much, Ivan.
Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I wasn't aware that I was supposed to provide context. I'm used to these historian philosopher conferences where everybody's nitpicking about footnotes, and suddenly I need to give you a big picture, which I guess historians are, it's what we're supposed to do in general. So what I prepared for you is what I labeled as a radical historical reading of the current crisis. I call it replication crisis, and I know that there's already going to be nitpicking about the word replication and replicability, but I'm going to leave that to somebody else, Aiko in particular. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the historical antecedents or some of the previous episode in the history of discipline of psychology that kind of led to the mess that we're currently in. And my talk is going to be very much focused on psychology. I'm going to talk about open science movement as a type of a reform movement at the end of the talk. But I think it could be an interesting case to compare to other disciplines that are currently in the same problems with the kind of statistics that are being used and criticized and research designs that are problematic in the ongoing crisis. Why did I label my talk as a radical historical reading, and what's going to be radical about it? Well, that's a very difficult thing to specify, especially for a very interdisciplinary audience like you have here today, I think. So I would like to unpack a bit what I mean by radical. By radical, I usually, what I imagined was that it's my point of view, I think, is peripheral to a number of communities that talk about the replicability crisis. I think for psychologists who are involved in this, who are really deep in the reform movement, they don't engage that much with historical arguments. They usually engage with philosophical arguments. So this is going to be weird for reformers. For historians of science, this kind of argument that I'm going to give you here is also a bit strange, because what I aim to do is to use historical thinking to evaluate current research programs. And historians of science nowadays are very reluctant to do such things, to make normative judgments like the philosophers do, let's put it like that. But I'm going to try and attempt doing that, and I welcome criticism. And I do believe that this is radical for these particular communities. If you don't recognize anything radical and everything is evident for you, then I guess you're in the sweet spot that I am in, and this kind of perspective is natural for you. Another remark about this kind of doing history is what this kind of history is trying to do. I think good history or good historical thinking that's useful for these kinds of debates that are really important for the disciplines that are affected do three things. The first thing is uncovering historical contingencies that have become invisible, kind of paths untaken that we don't see anymore. So in a sense, if you think about, you can have this simplistic view of scientific disciplines progressing through history, right? Getting better and better and better. But this is something that historians of science would be very reluctant to do. They wouldn't engage with these kind of arguments of progress. What they would do, and what they're really good at, I think, is actually uncovering things that have become invisible because time has passed. So we always look from our current position at, I don't know, in the case of psychology, Wundt's laboratory, how it was founded, behaviorism, the cognitive revolution, etc. So we have this kind of textbook narrative of the science progressing and changing through time. But what happens in the particular episodes in the history of that science is that actually things are very uncertain, and nobody knows what future holds, right? So they're not, in the debates that they're having in the 20s and the 30s, at the end of the 19th century, late in the 20th century, they're not sure with what kind of science are we going to end up. Who are going to be the victors so to say, in the intellectual arena that they're in. And this actually means that there's a lot of paths that are possible in those old discussions that have disappeared for our perspective nowadays. And this leads me to the second thing, that I think many historians nowadays are kind of reluctant to do this because of the bad memory of the science wars of the 90s, and that's uprooting givens. So kind of really shaking up something that a critical sociologist would call myths that are currently current in disciplines. I would avoid talking of myths and naivety and things like that, but I think this kind of exercise is very useful to think about the fundamentals we're educated into as scientists. And the third thing is that I'm not going to do much in this presentation because I'm going to try to do a lot anyways, is speaking truth to power. So it's this awareness that science is also a collection of institutions that have their own power dynamics. And on the basic level, in the reform movement nowadays, discussions of prestige are very common. What does signal prestige? What does it mean to publish in certain journals? Do open access journals have prestige? Are all the departments and all the universities involved to the same extent in the reform movement? Are some conservative because other reasons, etc.? So all these topics are actually something related to the institutional setup of the power dynamics within the disciplines that are affected. Okay. So that's just a general outline of the way that I think about things. So I hope I will be a bit more comprehensible as I go on. So I'm going to, in the talk, discuss three big episodes. And from those episodes, I'm going to try to draw three what I call radical theses. I explained what radical would mean for me. The first episode that I'm going to discuss is operationism or operationalism. So how did psychology proper as a scientific discipline during the 20th century end up with the idea of operational definitions and operationalizing concepts? The second thing that I'm going to discuss is psychological literature and our ideas of what is scientific literature in general. And the interesting thing is that I'm going to keep talking about psychologists and psychologists thinking about these things, but it's not like psychology is unique in this. So there are very strong parallels in different scientific disciplines in the period for the kind of thinking that I'm going to discuss. And I know it might sound weird. What do you mean what the psychological literature is? You'll see what I mean with it. It's actually what hides behind this is a discussion of cumulative science. So what are ideas of cumulativity and what does it mean for a discipline to gather cumulative knowledge? And the third thing is kind of trying to uncover or hint at a possible alternative for the current epistemological standard that you have in scientific psychology, and that's the standard of the aggregate. And what hides behind this is a very old and tired criticism of quantitative methodologies that has been going on in the disciplines of history of psychology, in philosophy of science, in critical psychology throughout the 20th century without much success in affecting what's happening with the mainstream in the discipline. Okay, let's go into operationism. So here I put two pictures. I guess historians are supposed to talk about years and put pictures of old white men. This guy on the left is Percy Bridgman. He's a Harvard physicist who won a Nobel Prize at some point. And he's here because he wrote this book that's very important for first postulating what we would recognize as operationism. Here's a placeholder for Stanley S. Stevens, who's his psychologist colleague from Harvard, who translated a lot of that stuff into psychology. I couldn't find a good picture of him, so I just put a placeholder in. So what is operationism and how did Bridgman imagine it in 1927 when he wrote The Logic of Modern Physics? It's a very kind of 1920s title to a book. He wrote A Logic of Modern Physics, right? So this is how he proposed what operationism would be. So he said, in general, we mean by any concept nothing more than a set of operations. The concept is synonymous with the corresponding set of operations. If the concept is physical, as of length, the operations are the actual physical operations, namely those by which length is measured, etc. So this was a very radical epistemological position to hold. Bridgman is usually interpreted as just one of the cookie-cutter logical positivists of the early 20th century. The story is much more complicated. Was he a logical positivist? Logical positivists were already having these big discussions about protocol sentences and verification principles. Hempel gave up on the whole deal later on. So he's not actually a logical positivist. He's even more radical at the time than they are. And what happened with Bridgman here is that this kind of idea that all the scientific concepts that you have in a scientific discipline, like physics or psychology, are defined by the operations we use to measure them. So a length is defined by the ruler that we use to measure the length, basically. That kind of position never fared well within physics. So he was very strongly criticized by physicists. He was strongly criticized by logical positivists and analytical philosophers of the day. And the position of operationism didn't survive in physics proper. It did survive in psychology. And how come this thoroughly weird epistemological position turned into bureaucratic practice in scientific psychology, even though that it didn't survive in the discipline that it was basically imagined for? And the story about that is a really, really complicated, interesting historical episode that you have a bunch of historians writing and discussing this for years. Psychologists have been discussing this for decades. So since the 30s to today, you have spurts of discussions of operationism, basically. The perspective that I like the most on what happened with operationism and how it ended up in psychology is the one by Uliana Feist, who is a historian and a German historian and philosopher of psychology, where she says that operationists actually attempted to formulate a methodology for empirical psychology which was sensitive to the problems with introspectivism and mentalism, and which forced psychologists to explicate their prior assumptions about how to interpret observations. What hides behind this? So the usual way of thinking about operationism, it's a philosophical epistemological position that gives us a way to define concepts. So it gives us a way to understand what's the meaning of concepts. But what Feist would argue here is that's not what psychologists recognized in operationism. So the way that they reappropriated it into their discipline is actually as a way of, as a type of a methodology. So as a type of how should I proceed in doing my research by producing operational definitions. So this whole discussion of meaning, the philosophical debates in analytical philosophy, the crisis of logical positivism, the fall of logical positivism, etc., that was kind of all on the surface, but for psychologists that wasn't that relevant at the time or later on. And then that expanded into the story of how it became actually bureaucratic practice, not only a practice of choice. And the interesting history here is how it relates to construct validity theory and actually APA's, the American Psychological Association's standardization and specification of how psychologists in their varied disciplines should go about operationalization. And keep in mind here, I know it might sound weird for anybody who's familiar with psychology in 2019, especially if you're a reformer, that APA has any influence. It was very influential at the time. So it was the scientific discipline. It was going through this big crisis of it becoming more of a professional organization than a scientific organization. But at the time, it was still extremely influential on scientific practice of psychologists at large. And what happened with operationalism, as I said, this discussion kept going on. It's not like people uncritically accepted being operationalists. So there was the constant criticism kept coming in the decades that followed, but it got drowned. It got drowned in something that the historian Gail Horstein would call ignoring the opposition. She calls this debating tactic. I don't think it's a debating tactic in the case of operationism. It's more like a statement of fact of what was happening. And what was happening is that the theoretical ambiguities surrounding the work became buried in the profusion of empirical findings that emerged from the laboratories. So operationalism gave you the tools to produce a lot of studies and to generate a lot of empirical insight. And that kind of completely pushed away the need to get into the discussion of what does it actually mean to provide operational definitions, and do we have to have an agreement across the board about this. But operationalism was just one part of this. One buttress in the really confetti factory of research that you have in psychology. So scientific psychology in the 20th century really, when you look at its literature, it really started behaving like a natural science in the publication practices. So the literature kept expanding, doubling in size every decade basically. It was humongous. It kept growing during the 20th century, and it was humongous and unsurveyable. And here I call it old-fashioned idea of a cumulative science. You can disagree with me if it's old-fashioned. I guess many of us here would want a cumulative science, so that's something for a discussion point later on. But is operationism the full extent of the story of how psychologists ended up with this literature? And is it an explanation of how psychologists actually perceive their literature? And that's definitely not the case. That would be a simplification to say. But the thing is that the way that we perceive scientific literature is also historically variable and depends by discipline. And my argument would be that part of the problem is this combination of factors that led to the literature in the end. And this kind of idea of what kind of purpose should the literature serve. And I think we really recognize this in the ongoing crisis that we have, in the sense that this idea that the ever-expanding repository of knowledge, that is the literature, is the ever-expanding repository of knowledge, right? That people are starting to think, no, the literature is actually something different because it's full of irreplicable or unreplicable results. So a lot of stuff that is not actually something that we would recognize as robust knowledge. And another interesting factor about this is I think there's a generational difference in this, in the sense that when you think about it in the 2000s, 2010s, I think the people who really had a firm and utter belief in the literature were bachelor students, master students, maybe grad students in the early years. But people who were familiar with how publishing went and how research went and what the ongoing research practices were and were critical, were much more skeptical of what could be found in the literature. So there was this, I think, discrepancy in how familiar were you with the practices that were producing the literature, which related to how much trust you put into it. So, but what is the literature? I think this is one of the questions that I would like the reform movement to really explicitly discuss, so to say. Is the literature a collection of research fronts, so a collection of findings that are interesting but we're not sure if they're true, or is it actually a collection of justified true belief, of things that we can be really sure about? And depending on this answer, our standards of a problem or a crisis with the literature will change very much. And also then, what is cumulative knowledge? Or does the literature produce cumulative knowledge or something else that we need to build out of the literature if we think the literature doesn't actually collect true statements? The way psychologists went about literature during the 20th century also has some pretty interesting episodes. I isolated 3 here, but I'm just going to discuss the information overload now. Baserman's look at it, it's really interesting because he's not a historian actually, he's a rhetorician who looks at how psychologists wrote research reports during the 20th century. But it's a long story, I'm not going to go into that. But the information overload one is fascinating. You would think that this problem with the size of the literature was relatively new, but it wasn't. It was there since the beginning of the 20th century. And that's, I found, so this, when you listen to the discussion, we need slow science, the literature is just expanding like crazy. Psychologists were struggling with this since the beginning of the 20th century. Like this paper by Sigel and Petit is a discussion of how psychologists in the APA came up with the publication manual or the guidelines for writing articles. And the idea for the guidelines and the publication manual was to tackle information overload. So we need to standardize research papers in order to deal with the huge amount of literature that is kind of drowning us, and we can't even read within our own subspecialties. So you can see also later ideas of how to tackle with information overload that came from psychology in stuff like literature reviews, meta-analysis, which are methodological interventions in organizing the literature, and databases. Basically, it's a very interesting story with psychological abstracts. I don't know how many of you are aware of the journal Psychological Abstracts that used to exist. So Psychological Abstracts was basically an abstracting journal where you would just find abstracts and titles of articles from other journals, which in the middle of the 20th century turned into a database, and that's PsycInfo that we have nowadays, right? So you see this, the technology was different, the capabilities were different to deal with the information overload, but it was there. This thinking about the literature, what I was talking in the beginning, also I find this a very, very funny thing. I guess many people will not like this comparison. Data thugs is tongue-in-cheek, of course. I'm not serious. I think reformers. But I think with this changing perception of what the literature is becoming more mainstream, I think the reformers in psychology have a much different idea of what are scientific facts and how do they end up in the literature. And I would call that view very Latourian. So Bruno Latour is an STS scholar, a sociologist of science, who is quite controversial, or used to be quite controversial, who has this idea about the way that a construction of facts happens in scientific laboratories, in biology, physics, and psychology. And he would say that facts get constructed in the laboratory and solidify through the process of publication. But that doesn't mean that they're solid when they end up in the literature. So they can still be debated and unpacked, and stuff can happen with them. And I think this is very much in line with what's happening in the reform movement. Okay. So how much time do I have? Okay, I'm still good. So the last thing that I'm going to shortly discuss is actually the biggest topic, I think. And that's the role of quantitative methodologies. And I avoided using the word quantitative methodologies here with a reason, not only to fancy it up in some kind of historian's lingo, but because when you say quantitative methodologies, you already presuppose this bifurcation into quantitative and qualitative, and that's already, the system is already in place. But if you talk about the aggregate, you can actually unpack it with how it was happening earlier in the 20th century. So when we talk about this rise of the aggregate, or the rise of importance as an epistemological standards of quantitative way of thinking in psychology, you often run into this little anecdote. So I took this actually from a Kuhn paper that I'm going to discuss in the next slide. This is the facade of the Social Science Research Building at the University of Chicago, which has this quote by Kelvin on it: "If you cannot measure, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory." So I think this kind of sums up the ideals of social science during the 20th century, and what American universities gave traction to within their social science thinking, not only in psychology, but also in sociology and other social science disciplines. But this thing is, as you can imagine, this way of looking at social science as a way toward progress is heavily contested during the whole period and still nowadays. And I could give you very many examples out of very prominent historians of psychology who contest this idea that quantitative is progress and quantitative is the epistemological standard. But I'm not going to quote some historian of psychology that you know, that you don't know. I'm going to quote Kuhn here. And this is a paper that he wrote before the Structure of Scientific Revolution, where he goes into what's the function of measurement in modern physical science. So what do natural scientists do with measurement, and did that change through time, and how do they employ measurement in the arguments that they have about their theories. And Kuhn is, he was always very skeptical of social science and social science research, and always had this idea that it didn't live up to the standards that he imagined in the physical sciences, which is not a position I would agree at all. But he had some interesting observations about why social science is in the problem that it was in, as he recognizes, in the 60s and later on. So Kuhn's argument is that the full and intimate, oh, this is fancy language now. The full and intimate quantification of any science is a consummation devotedly to be wished. Nevertheless, it is not a consummation that can effectively be sought by measuring. What he's saying is the natural sciences didn't have the ideal of we need to measure everything and the measurement is the stick that we're going to use to compare everything from the very beginning. So there was this very long, protracted stage that took centuries where only qualitative phenomena were being discussed and generated within the communities of natural philosophers, who then at some point switched to quantification as a much more efficient way to handle debates within their disciplines. What am I saying here? Am I saying that psychologists shouldn't quantify at all and that you should drop all the fancy statistics that we're going to discuss now and we're all wasting our time? Not necessarily. I think this kind of, we need to behave like physics. I think that's a very, very old trope that doesn't help us at all. But it does open up a kind of critical space, I think, for discussion, because psychology now is in a much different state than physics was in, I don't know, 18th, 19th century. So the literature is very different. The amount of people participating in discussions is much larger. The rules for discussions are very, so all the factors, institutional and social factors, are very different. And the question is, can we sustain accumulative science within this context? And this is a more traditional criticism of this rise of the aggregate statistics within psychology. This is a great historian of psychology that's really, really, I think, one of the most important historians in late 20th century, Kurt Danziger, who makes this argument that the rise of aggregate statistics was a very slow process that happened within American psychology, and as it was finished, it became invisible that it happened to begin with. And Danziger makes this argument how mental testing and experimentalism, two branches of psychology in late 19th century that were very much separate, through this rise of statistics and statistical thinking and thinking in groups, became merged through operationism, construct validity theory, and etc. And we ended up with the methods that we have nowadays. Danziger also makes this relatively controversial argument about how aggregates weren't only scientifically useful, but they were also very socially practical. That psychologists in early 20th century needed to make their discipline useful. They broke off from philosophy, but now they needed to market themselves in American society in early and middle 20th century. And what they could do is, if they used aggregate statistics, they could co-opt existing groups as their subject matter, or completely generate new ones. And what do I mean generate new ones? Intelligence testing is a great example. As intelligence testing was applied in different settings, suddenly you could separate students in classes with different levels of ability, which means you could generate new groups which would solve problems within the educational system that existed at the time. So it was an intellectual development that was also practically important. I put this in just not to forget about it, but because it's an important part of the story of statistics and operationalization, and that's the inferential revolution from the 30s to the 60s. That's very often discussed in the reform movement, I think. That's the rise of null hypothesis significance testing in psychology. So I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I think most of us kind of know how the story goes. But it's part of this tool solidification that happened during the 20th century that led to the literature that we have nowadays. Okay, so that was a lot of information, right? So what was I trying to say here? What we ended up with at the end of the 20th century is a particular epistemological standard within scientific psychology. I'm not saying that all scientific psychologists do research like that. We still have qualitative psychologists. We have all kind of interdisciplinary sciences in the middle. We had the cognitive revolution, which did different things to psychology, etc. But the standard, the normative ideal within the discipline was quantitative and objective, and idea that those methods will lead to a cumulative science, and also, which is very important, that this science is an apolitical treatment of potentially politically controversial topics. I know this might be very controversial to just put on a slide without explaining it, but I'm going to do that. How would we organize this whole mess of what was happening during the 20th century? So what I would say is that there's three very broad areas that were institutionalized within psychology that produce the kind of science that's in crisis nowadays. The epistemological scaffolding, the philosophical justification of why this is a science, was provided by this combination of operationism and construct validity theory. And even though operationism and construct validity theory had their problems at inception and were hotly contested and debated through the whole period, they turned into a day-to-day practice for psychologists. So this philosophical thinking got turned into something practically applicable by applied researchers and basic researchers through statistics, through cookbooks, through education, through journal requirements. It became part and parcel of the institutions that psychologists recognize. And these things produced the literature. So they produced this repository that supposedly accumulates. But now we're hearing it doesn't, actually. Right? So this leads me to my three radical conclusions that if you followed my talk, and I know it was, as I said, a lot, but they're not going to seem as radical, maybe. The first one is, as I said now, is that the constantly expanding unsurveyable literatures of fields poor with qualitative phenomena are not conducive to convergent cumulative work. So what happens is that we produce so much empirical studies that are just so difficult to take stock of that I think many of us really struggle with how to make sense out of this and how to actually build on each other's work. And I can tell you, as I did my PhD on data mining digital study of journals in psychology, where I tried to data mine all the journals in PsycInfo from the 50s to the end of the 90s. That was a hot mess. Just, I'm not going to even start on that, but it was really a hot mess with just deciding on what is the discipline of psychology, what are the journals that we should take in, just coming up with these basic criteria on what we would recognize as a discipline. A solution to this hot mess is open science as a reform movement. So open scientific practices that will change some of these institutionalized ways that psychologists were going about their business for decades. And here I'm going to be very negative, and I hope you prove me wrong. But I believe that methodological reform will not solve methodological problems. And I think some voices within the reform movement nowadays are recognizing this. Some are announcing a measurement crisis, a theory crisis, I don't know what crisis. So there are very many crises that are being announced. And I think the methodological, increasing methodological sophistication and being critical about the methodologies that we use is just part of the problem. But it's not going to solve the issue at stake. And that leads me to my second radical speculative thesis, is that the replicability crisis is actually just a symptom of wider issues with institutions central to scientific psychology. And I think anybody who's involved in the reform movement is acutely aware of this. Because, so the moment you realize that journals are a problem, peer review doesn't function like it's supposed to function, not only in psychology but in other disciplines. Statistics is being used in a very weird way. We have no format for substantive theoretical discussions. We have very huge difficulties with thinking about our epistemological fundamentals. So it's just a symptom of a mess. And my third thesis is very self-serving. As a young historian slash philosopher slash I don't know what I am anymore, I do think that the current debates that are happening within the reform movement are really fertile ground, so to say. The community organization is marvelous. The kind of optimism that's happening is very unlike to my own perspective that's very doom and gloom, right? So there's a lot of positive emotion and a lot of action that's happening and a lot of good and critical thinking and trying to identify the problems and come up with solutions. But I think this needs to be organized even more on this more abstract level. And for that, we need good philosophers of social science. We need good historians who are going to tell you the story that I told you in a much more competent and better informed way that's not this whole mess that I did. We need good theoretical psychologists who will have outlets to actually discuss their work and to organize these empirical studies that are being replicated currently. And I already started some of this work in trying to understand what kind of epistemological thinking you can find in the reform movement. And I think it's very interesting. I used the term indigenous epistemology before. It's a term that historian Lawrence Smith came up with. Indigenous means that it's an epistemology that comes out of the research program of the scientists themselves. So it's not something that a philosopher imagines, but it's somebody like Tolman, who was a neo-behaviorist at the beginning of the cognitive revolution, who started thinking about scientists like rats because he was doing research on rats. So it's this kind of extension of his own psychological project into epistemological issues. I think we need more of that, and that explicitly so. And that's already happening in the reform movement to an extent. I think we do have a basic indigenous epistemology among the reformers about humans as irrational. And scientists being humans are also irrational, and all these things that are happening with misuses, questionable research practices, questionable measurement practices, etc., are the consequences of irrational actors not being systematically corrected. My bigger problem, this whole part about the irrationality of scientists is interesting and useful. I think my bigger problem is the descriptions of the science system that are happening here. And I think the descriptions that we run into are usually some kind of logical positivist reading or falsificationism or Mertonian norms or some kind of taking Mill's thinking and saying Mill was right. But I don't think that actually does justice to the scientific system that we currently have. So we need philosophical and critical work that tells us what the institutions currently are and what would be institutions that would serve us better in the future. And on that note, I hope I haven't depressed you too much with all the doom and gloom in the presentation here. I hope I framed what's going to happen in the next 2 days in a way that motivates us. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what is this new science system that reformers want us to build for psychology and what it's going to do for our ailing institutions. Thank you very much.